Thank you, first of all, for National Emergency Management Agency for organizing this event and for the invitation. Also recognize the conference organizers for their hard work and very well managed event. And of course, I'm very pleased to participate. Before I start on the talk, it occurred to me that most people here probably are not familiar with John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and so I wanted to say a few things very briefly about the college that may be of interest to the group. John Jay is an element of the City University of New York, which is a public college system within the city. And aside from criminal justice, the college offers a number of other majors, and including bachelor's degrees in fire and emergency management with basically a management degree for personnel in the fire services, fire science degree, which is a more math and science-based degree, which includes components on fire investigation or fire protection system technology. And we also offer a master's degree program called Protection Management, which again is a management-focused degree with 3 separate tracks: emergency management, fire protection, and security. Ironically, we started our emergency management track, had been under development for several years, and we started our first course offerings in September of 2001. We also host international students. We currently have students from Saudi Arabia, Greece. In the past, we've had students from South Korea, Trinidad, Turkey, and other countries. And we've also organized an international conference on urban emergency management in 2002 and 2003. And the proceedings are available online at the web address at the end of the talk. Lastly, we have 7 full-time faculty, which makes us one of the larger concentrations of full-time professors working in this area in the U.S. We are interdisciplinary faculty. We include engineers, urban planners, sociologists, industrial psychologists, and others. And we have primary expertise in private security, emergency response, high-rise buildings, human behavior in fire and disaster, and emergency service deployment and risk. Okay. Today, what we're going to discuss first is document problems in emergency response. And basically, we're talking about the issue of after-action reports. And I'm not sure if that terminology is common here, but post-incident analysis or some systematic process by which lessons or information is gathered following a response that is used to reinforce and provide information for improving service in the future. Then I will talk about an academic-based research center which was formed at the college actually just a year ago this month, and the mission and scope of that center. Then I will talk about national and international trends in emergency management, the consistency of the approach for after-action reporting that we're advocating with international efforts, and then finally future directions and suggested research initiatives. So everyone is familiar with the trends toward urbanization and the implications for emergency management and disaster response generally. And as many speakers on the conference have indicated, all the challenges of emergency management are complicated or enhanced in a urban environment. And issues such as lifelines, organizational response, and dealing with complex infrastructure, and the need for effective governmental and organizational response, all those needs are amplified in a highly urban environment. The traditional approach to after-action reports, and I'm speaking primarily from a U.S. context here, is variable, highly variable is a nice way of putting it. Most after-action reports are traditionally performed by a single organization and as a consequence, their scope is limited to a single discipline. So in other words, if you have a large-scale emergency, you may have police services, you may have public works, you may have fire services, you may have independent emergency medical services. Often in the U.S., each one of those organizations will do their own after-action process, and they may or may not produce a report. And very often there is not coordination between the production of those reports or those documents, and so many times opportunities to look at problems or to identify concerns, emergent issues that may fall between boundaries of organizations do not get taken advantage of. And this approach really grows out in large measure of our experiences in New York on 9/11 and the prospect, the difficulties we had in New York in terms of documenting what had happened after the event. And so an after-action report in its basics includes some kind of documentation of the incident, a summary of facts, and then hopefully an identification of challenges or aspects of the response that were successful or potentially in need of improvement, and then importantly to identify emerging challenges. And of course, as Dr. Brown had indicated, after-action reports can be crucial for developing an empirical basis for developing evidence-based approaches to training and curriculum for emergency management and response. So the existing environment, as we discussed, basically local agencies often, and in the U.S., emergency response, disaster response is largely a local government function. Although there are significant state and federal involvement, certainly with presidentially declared disasters, the vast majority of the personnel who are mitigating the incident, for the most part, are local government operators. They may come from outside under federal coordination, but they're still local government people. After-action reports are not uniformly produced, and they are not often they are not released to the public, and for various reasons. Many times there's a fear of liability, that there can be legal ramifications if an organization admits that there were difficulties in the emergency response. And of course, there's always the need to avoid embarrassment or disclosing that things were not perfect during an emergency. But of course, those are organizational issues that everyone faces, and we'll talk about how we can get around those a little later. Those reports that do get released may not be readily accessible. For example, some after reports are released only in written form. They're not put on the internet and made available, or they may be released online, but they're not permanently posted online, and so they are up for a couple of weeks and then they disappear. And as a consequence, there's really no good mechanism for collecting or capturing all those after-action reports that are prepared. FEMA, for federally declared disasters, does do after-action reports. However, again, in terms of access, some of those same issues apply. And the final concern with the existing environment is their after-action reports tend to be produced at the headquarters level, understandably, but the personnel involved in it, the information gets filtered heavily, and so there may be a very significant divergence between the experience of first responders or persons on the ground and what ends up in the report in terms of what issues are focused on. Now, some of those concerns are simply those of resources, and it takes a lot of time and energy to go down to that level of detail to collect information, but it's not always the case. So if you look at this, another way to look at the problem of after-action reports, and this is from James Thompson, Organizations in Action, and there it is, okay. And you look at the various functions of an organization, At the institutional level, that's the highest level of the organization, usually responsible for interface with elected officials or higher levels of government, and also laterally with other organizations within their government. These are the high-level people, usually appointees. Then at the managerial level, these are the people who are interface between the highest level people and the operational personnel in the organization. They carry out policy, may design policy, and basically translate the institutional goals into what goes on the ground. And then finally, the technical level, which is where the sheer numbers of your personnel exist. These are the people who are, for the most part, out in the field delivering service. Examples of documents that we produce in the U.S. At each one of those levels. So we have training materials, and Anthony, I couldn't put an IFSTA thing up there, I'm sorry. But we have firefighter training manuals, which are directly applied to the technical level. This is an example of a kind of an after-action report that's produced by the U.S. Fire Administration. They're an element of FEMA, which is an element of the Department of Homeland Security, and that's geared at the managerial level for the most part. And then you have institutional documents, which are fairly rare that they come out. Usually these are a result of major events, certainly almost all of them presidentially declared disasters or some other kind of calamity. And those, however, usually for the most part focus on institutional issues, institutional policies. And so what you get in a report like this often is not going to provide direct guidance to people who are operating at the technical level of the organization. And likewise, the technical manuals don't really help you to deal with and address institutional issues. And as an example of some of these limitations of the current system we have, very simple operational guidance for many types of disasters is just not available or vetted in a form that everyone agrees. So there may not be lessons that are potentially developed in terms of operations during flooding or inundation for law enforcement or firefighting personnel may not always be captured and may not be readily available. So as a consequence, there's no formal mechanism for post-incident analysis or after-action reports. The quality of the reports can vary highly from organization to organization. There tends to be poor documentation of emergency response services at the technical level, large-scale events. And of course, this presents a number of issues for us, one of which is the loss of opportunity for gaining feedback on how we are doing. It identifies or frustrates research efforts because we don't always have good data and information on what is going on in the field, which frustrates empirical data and evidence-based management. Of course, we have loss of, as a consequence, there's little guidance that results for emergency response policy, and a loss of information on actual events. And then finally, in the worst case, of course, we have mistakes that can recur or be repeated, and knowledge about a particular event is lost or is held by the individual responders who were involved, but as they move on in their careers, go to other events, that information goes with them. It doesn't get captured. So obviously, we're promoting the idea of a learning organization, and I think everyone here would be in agreement that that's something that's worthwhile, and we all want to be part of a learning organization. And so, as we said before, collecting after-action reports in a systematic way can help lead to developing cross-disaster comparisons, identify regularities in data, which will come in terms of resource needs, and matching supplies and demand, forecasting potential requirements in advance, and then identify gaps in training, staffing, equipment, or response mechanisms, and finally improving estimation and mobilization of resources prior to and during disaster. Now, an analytic precedent that we think holds great promise for the first responder community in emergency management is one that's been developed and used by the U.S. Army, and they have an organization called the Center for Army Lessons Learned. And we'll talk about that. It's fairly involved, but the key components of that process are after-action reports, and there's a training mechanism for personnel to produce the reports, and the reports come from ground level, low-level operators in the field, and are then submitted directly for review by trained analysts. And so the analysts tend to be very senior, experienced people who have the ability to vet the information and identify underlying trends and issues. And so you don't have the problem of raw data coming in and kind of getting thrown up onto a public venue. So this is just a slight modification of a typical organizational feedback loop a la Edgar Schein. But basically, we start with impact from the environment. The impact, of course, in emergency management may be a literal impact. And then we use, obviously, some kind of a method for going in and collecting information in the context of the organizational infrastructure, the knowledge base, systems, values, et cetera. As a consequence of this, there's a revision of the theory about what is working and how it's working. This is subsequently incorporated into the organizational knowledge base, all these things up here. So this changes from event to event. And then based on this, we approach the next event in a slightly different way. Now, one thing you should bear in mind, or actually two things, in terms of the Army's method for doing this, is I want to make very clear that the two things. One is the Army's method is not an enforcement tool. It's not an inspection tool. It's strictly used to generate information from ground level personnel. And because of that, of course, it carries a tremendous moral weight. And it would be difficult and hard-pressed for an organization to resist the information that flows from the grassroots personnel who are coming up. And the Army Center for Army Lessons Learned specifically does not get involved in disciplinary issues. And if there are cases where accepted and known procedures are not followed, that's not in their mission. Okay, so those would go through the normal operational elements of the response organizations. Let's see, the second was that the cycle that the Army uses for this and through their Center for Lessons Learned is they provide interim guidance on a short turnaround so that they can have an influence between development of curricula. And so they don't develop the training curriculum, they don't develop the guidelines or procedures used in the Army. They provide information that helps people to interpret those and potentially be used as inputs for revision of curricula. But it's a very successful model and highly effective. The organization has been in existence for almost 25 years, and they have almost 250 employees around the world. Okay, so shifting now to the Christian Regenhard Center at John Jay. The mission of the center very much grew out of 9/11, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but it's a responder-focused analysis and research on emergency response and applied problems of incident management. And so very much we want to be, have our sleeves up, have one foot in reality out in the street with the first responders, and our mission is to produce information that's going to be directly applicable to the first response community. And so the capabilities include, we have developed a national advisory board of people from within the U.S. They're all emergency response subject matter experts. The vast majority of them are actually uniformed personnel who are active in their organizations, and they come from across the United States, from organizations that have a combination of being very busy, having some recognition, and the people are very active with this group. And then we have core faculty, obviously, from within the college, and a mechanism for affiliated research faculty from the rest of the world, as well as accepting visiting scholars. And we have had our first visiting scholar already, someone from Italy who did some very interesting work comparing European Union and US approaches to disaster management, or more narrowly, incident management. So the Christian Regenhard Center is named for the firefighter you see on the page here, Christian Regenhard, who perished in the collapse of the World Trade Center. He was a probationary firefighter. His mother, Sally Regenhard, took a very active role in advocacy, and she formed an organization known as the Skyscraper Safety Campaign, which was very instrumental in a number of developments, including the revision and adoption of a new building code in New York City, which included specific revisions targeted at hardening high-rise buildings to potential terrorist attack. The funding of the World Trade Center collapse study by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, as well as really a small, not a small role in terms of formation of the 9/11 Commission, which, as you may recall, was originally opposed by the administration. So the center is set to produce working papers, publications, conferences, and seminars. And we also are working with another center at the college, and we've established an incident data archive, and we're in the early stages of developing MOUs with other institutions, emergency management organizations within the U.S. to collect emergency management after-action reports, primary information, and documentation from incidents. And the thought is that this will be used as a research source, and in the future we'll be able to inform curriculum development and training. Now, this is just a proposed structure. It's something we're advocating in terms of how this would, after-action methodology would work, and it can be adapted to other organizational contexts. Whoops. Okay. Basically, obviously, in the U.S., at the federal level, this is looking at federally declared disasters. But basically, there's a program management analysis, a field team or site team collection management process, and a production of reports that goes on. And here you have the first responder community, and then AAR is short for after action reports. And so people in the field would develop after action reports. They would come in, they would go through this process. In addition, there would be methods for collecting data. And then all this would go on in coordination with the centers of excellence, the academic partners, some of the academic partners at DHS, existing measures, information sharing at DHS, and this is the Army, and various first responder organizations, associations generally across the country. And this is a duplication of what Mr. Waters had presented, so I won't read all these, but there's a large group of academics who were mobilized and working on Homeland Security related issues within the U.S. Okay, the last part, I guess, is bringing this, the next to last part, bringing this to localizing it and looking at it in an international context. Okay. The current United Nations and Asian regional concept, you have a number of activities that are ongoing, and the search and rescue group, INSARAG, and the General Assembly Resolution 57/150 just talks about strengthening of cooperation among states at the regional and sub-regional levels in the field of disaster preparedness and response, with a particular respect to capacity building at all levels. And we don't really have time to get into it, but you can see that using this kind of a method where you're engaging first responders, field personnel in development of information and in vetting this process can have a very strong impact in terms of capacity building. And then the Hyogo framework for action, the strategic goals include more effective mitigation and preparedness and development and strengthening of institutions, mechanisms, and capacities at all levels. And then among the priorities for action, undertake post-event reviews. And so this approach, I think, falls very consistent with kind of best practices and things going on in this region and internationally. So essentially, this would involve engagement between, at the national level, between engagement between government, industry, and academia. I think this kind of an approach can be very cost effective in that you're utilizing resources that are already in place in terms of academic institutions and educators. The collection of data is done essentially at minimal cost to the organizations involved. The analytic and collection capacity can be mobilized on an ad hoc basis and internationally as needed. Obviously, this will create a sense of a capability of institutional memory. It will promote best practices and more rapid cycle of improvement in disaster response, and will promote the development of internationally directed curricula for development of local leaders and emergency response organizations, and finally leverage existing investments and strengthen local capacity, as I had discussed previously. What we see is really the good features of such an approach is that it can foster international collaboration. It can promote data sharing and analysis. Clearly, it leads itself to exchange of staff and a cross-discipline focus and working groups. It suggests that there's a need for an agreement on a common data collection or after-action reporting scheme that can be used to have common elements across countries. And I think one of the developments that we've seized on fairly recently is that I think the idea of a multidiscipline, first responder focused approach is appropriate. And if we think about, major events, we look at Mumbai, it's, you can't, everybody's in one picture, right? Fire, police, EMS. So why does it make sense for this person to read one after-action report and this one reads another one, right? So likewise, this is actually an exercise in New York City, and all these organizations in reality are working together, or should be working together very closely. So in conclusion, I'm suggesting that a robust academic government partnership for emergency responder policy, post-incident analysis, and best practices should be advocated for. I think that it complements existing science and technology efforts. And we can document lessons learned from first responder perspective. And we've given some suggested organizational settings and linkages. As we said, it's consistent with national, international, and multinational aims, and offered a suggested approach for the future. So thank you very much.